Good to go.
Welcome back to Senate Education on Tuesday, March 21st, 2:32. Ms. St. James, we hope this was helpful to you. We decided to just have our walkthroughs with individual senators and then have you come in for a full 30 minutes and just take us through each of these bills that I believe you're responsible for drafted. So if we're going to go in order, we can start with S87. Certainly don't need line by line, but just an overview of what the bill would do.
Great. That's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel. So S87 is an act relating to Holocaust education in public schools. And I was listening into your testimony, and it sounds like there might be a little bit of confusion on the report you all asked for last year.
Okay.
The due date for that was actually in January.
Right.
Okay.
And I thought they asked.
I wasn't.
Yes.
Okay, so if you have all worked that out, great. There were a couple reports that did have March date.
Yeah.
In the legislation.
Okay.
It just wasn't one of them.
No, I appreciate the clarification very much. I know they did come to us at one point and said, we're not done. And I think we gave them until some time.
Great.
I would think Hayden's going to reach out to the agency and check in when we might get that report. And that'll give us a baseline of what's happening out there around Holocaust education.
Great.
Thank you.
Section 1 is a title section. This act may be studied as the Vermont Holocaust Studies Act. Section 2 is a finding section. And maybe for the interest of time, we can skip over and y'all can read. And if you have any questions, we can talk about them. Section 3 is adding, so on page 2, line 11. Section 3 is adding a statute to the Courses of Study chapter in Title 16, which is chapter 23. This is adding a new section here, section 914, entitled Holocaust Education. And it requires, remember, curriculum in the state of Vermont are supposed to be consistent curriculum-wide. So this bill requires each supervisory union to ensure a minimum of 6 hours of age and grade appropriate instruction on the Holocaust is included for grades 6 through 12 on an annual basis. And then it says that the instruction shall be integrated within the global citizenship or language arts content areas, but it may also be integrated in other content areas. Does that make sense to everyone as far as the use of the term content area? Okay, great. And then subsection B is what this instruction needs to include. So students need to be able to evaluate the morality of the Holocaust and reflect on the causes of related historical events. Page 3. It should be designed to help students gain insight into the importance of the protection of international human rights for all persons, promote students' understanding of how the Holocaust revealed the need for the term genocide, and led to international legislation that recognized genocide as a crime, stimulate students' reflection on the roles and responsibilities of citizens in democratic society, to combat misinformation, indifference, and discrimination, provide students, and I'm not going to read every single word, provide students with opportunities to contextualize and analyze patterns of behavior by individuals and groups. And then the categories that they're looking at are perpetrator, collaborator, bystander, upstander, victim, and rescuer. Enable students to understand the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Preserve the memories of Holocaust survivors. Provide opportunities for students to discuss and honor survivors' legacies. Provide students with a foundation for examining the history of discrimination, and explore the various mechanisms of transitional and restorative justice that helped humanity move forward in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Page 4 requires AOE to provide technical assistance to supervisory unions and school districts for the purpose of providing this instruction. And that assistance has to include identifying sources, strategies, and content for providing this education or enhancing education that's already out there. advising superintendents and headmasters of approved independent schools in Vermont on strategies and content for Holocaust education, identify programs and sources of professional development related to providing Holocaust education, promote in schools into the general population of Vermont implementation of Holocaust education, and carry out any other tasks it considers to be advisable to support the ability of the state to meet the goals of providing Holocaust education. So I think an important piece to point out here is that the requirement here is only for public schools. And then D is a definition section. So the term genocide, and this definition I believe comes from the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And it means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So those acts are killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And then there's a definition of Holocaust, which shall mean the systemic, bureaucratic, and state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews and millions of other individuals, including Polish, Roma, disabled, and homosexual individuals, by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. And that definition is not word for word, but it's based on a definition used by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And then there's a transition provision, section 4, page 5, where the Holocaust studies shall be included in public school curricula for the 2024-2025 school year. So not this next school year, but the following school year. And that act shall take effect on July 1, 2023.
Who are you anticipating testify with this? Let's see that.
Support of it, well, or just in general?
In general.
So usually we would start the conversation with principals, associate, the teachers, all of those groups, and see what they have to say about it. We may even have the state board to understand a little bit around how we do curriculum versus, or how we do standards versus requirements. For example, one of the things we could do with this bill is to, I think, open up a request or somehow request the state board to consider this, because we generally don't do curriculum and we generally don't always do standards. Doesn't mean we don't have the ability to, but if I've never seen a bill that says we're going to give 6 hours of a certain kind of education. I thought we could start once we get this report back from the Agency of Education around what's happening out there, have them in and start to understand what that landscape looks like around what are kids getting and what are kids not getting.
Speaking to your point of the 6 hours provision, what did we do for the ethnic studies bill that, it was kind of, creating a highway for, the ethnic studies curriculum, but it was several years ago, but.
Yeah, do you remember how that process went out, please?
Well, I wasn't here when that bill was
Yeah.
written, but I have looked at it many times. And so
I wasn't on the committee when we did that.
it requires the Act One working group to make a series of recommendations, both to the General Assembly and the State Board of Education, related to you all, it's anything related to the work of the working group. But to the State Board of Education, it's amendments to the education quality standards. And then the State Board of Education is required to consider adopting the recommendations of the working group. The miscellaneous bill you will get from the House pushes some of the requirements dates in there. So the report back to the General Assembly and the State Boards and deadline out until June of this year. But the Act One does not require anything. It doesn't require any changes to the education quality standards or curriculum or courses of study. It requires a look at it and recommendations, both to the General Assembly and the State Board of Education. But it does leave, the way it's worded, it does leave discretion up to the state board on whether they adopt them or how they adopt them. And I believe the working group's recommendation has a recommendation into the state board, and the state board is currently working on, has a subcommittee that's currently working on the education quality standards. I think in a larger picture than just the Act One working group recommendations, but including the recommendations.
So we're expecting recommendations back from Act One working group in June.
I believe that's the date that it was pushed out to, yeah.
So we could, just one way to handle this is we could ask the Act One working group to consider this policy either by the time before the recommendations come back, which doesn't give them a lot of time, or they're not going, are they going to be dissolved after? They are being dissolved after. And is it possible, and we could talk to, who's the chair of Act One? Is it Amanda Garces?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, we could ask them, I mean, it's possible they may come back with recommendations around Holocaust studies.
It's totally possible. I haven't read it closely enough to speak to it, but their recommendations to the state board are very thorough. So, part of your consideration of this bill may be, you could hear from them on what that recommendation is or the work that they've done thus far. But they do have some written work product out that is on the state board's website, and the state board is working with that. That being said, you certainly could amend their duties and their charge and require them to consider additional information.
I do remember when we looked at this last year, there was several comments about we didn't want to do any kind of duplicative work while Act One was sort of getting their stuff organized. And so, for example, if all of a sudden there was a big push to mandate this, I could see where Act One and others might push back and say, well, we've been working on this kind of thing. Could you at least wait until we get our report out in June?
Maybe we should just ask them.
To come in and kind of let us know where they're at and whether or not this is even on the table. Okay, Hayden, do you mind doing that? Whoever the Act One chair is. So that, back to your question, did I answer that satisfactorily? Okay. Anything else for Ms. St. James on this bill?
Yep.
So we'll hear from an update from the Act One working group, and we will hear also from, maybe that's where we start. We'll go from there. Oh, and the agency on the report itself on how they're doing. Thank you. S-116.
S-116 is entitled the An Act Relating to the Board of Trustees of the University of Vermont State Agricultural College. And big picture is the bill proposes to add 2 faculty members to the Board of Trustees of the University of Vermont and the State Agricultural College. So you'll see the First Amendment on page 1, line 17, is increasing the total board compensation from 25 to 27. And then the substance of the amendment, there are conforming amendments just to, you'll see previously the word trustees was capitalized, and that's not our drafting convention anymore. So anytime we go into a statute and there's kind of old conventions, we try and clean it up. So there's a lot of crosses out of the trustees with a little T replacement. But on page 3, line 5 is the additional language. And that is 2 members shall be faculty employed, right? So this is talking about, every paragraph here talks about groups of trustees, legislative trustees, self-perpetuating trustees, student trustees, and this is adding a faculty trustee section on page 3, line 5. 2 members shall be faculty employed by the University of Vermont and State Agricultural College and elected by the faculty to a 6-year term expiring on August 1. The faculty senate shall oversee all faculty trustee elections, which shall be open to all faculty. Vacancies for any cause shall be filled through an election, and the term of the person so elected shall expire on the next following August 1.
So correct to assume there are no faculty members on board.
I don't know who's on the board, but there's the current law does not require a faculty member. And then there is
Just so you know, Senator Perslick mentioned this, sometimes there's sort of like an advisory person that comes in, but yeah, no voting member of the faculty.
I think we heard testimony last year in considering this, that yes, there might be, what's the right word? Liaisons, if you will.
We will. I like it.
But current law does not require faculty members to be voting members with a seat at the table in the trustee position.
So is there anything in here that stipulates that there are actually voting members? I don't see language.
It doesn't, let's see. I don't think any of these specifically state and they shall be voting members. The language is consistent with what's used throughout the rest of the section.
But it's understood that they have voting rights, whereas these advisory members don't have voting rights.
I don't, so I'm not saying that they are advisory members at all. I think that the term I think we heard was liaison, which to me is not a member at all. It's someone who kind of shows up and carries information between two bodies. But I would encourage you to hear testimony from folks on whether they feel this language is adequate to achieve your goals. I will say I don't believe that it spells out specifically that
They can vote.
that, well, for any of the categories of trustees. The trustees are charged with, all right. Let's see. Yes, so if you look at on page 4, line 9, this is all current law, except for that little piece. All trustees so appointed and elected constitute an entire board of the trustees. They have the entire management control of its property. And so this is talking about what their kind of duties are. And so they're all kind of grouped together. I don't believe it anywhere in here it spells out, they all shall be voting members. I think that's an assumed part of being on the board of trustees. And then there's a small transition section on page 5, section 2, that on or before August 1st, 2023, new faculty members shall be elected pursuant to section 1. The act takes effect on passage. And I just want to note, I should have noted this at the beginning of the walkthrough of this bill, that this is an amendment to the charter for University of Vermont, which appears in the Title 16 appendix, which is different than Title 16 itself. It's a whole separate section. And it contains all of the education charters in Vermont. So there are some school districts called incorporated school districts that were created by charters by the General Assembly. Most of them have been changed over the years, but they all live in the appendix to Title 16. And so does this language. So if you are going to look for it on your own or trying to point it out to a constituent, it's the Title 16 appendix.
So committee, I would just give some thought to, if you'd like to move in this direction. I think we'd probably get some pushback attaching something of this significance to a miscellaneous education bill. Doesn't mean we can't move it this year and have, it looked at by the full Senate next year. It's really like, I was thinking, we'll have a little testimony. You'll hear a lot of pushback from the University of Vermont and its trustees, and you'll have support from faculty and staff at the university. So,
S117. S117 is an act relating to teen parent education program funding. And this is a nice short one. You will notice that this is an amendment. So section 1, this is an amendment to session law. So this language currently only lives in session law. It's not in the green books anywhere. If this is something that you choose to take up, we can talk about whether it deserves a place in the green books, because this was very difficult to find. So in 2008, Acts and Resolve number 192, which I believe was the big bill that year, the budget bill that year, there was this language requiring school districts to pay parent education programs, I'm on page 2. 83% of the prior year's statewide average net cost per pupil, as opposed to 100%. So this bill proposes to remove that 83% and just require the school district to pay the teen parent education program the prior year's statewide average net cost per pupil, as calculated under statute. And then it also, on lines 5 through 10, allows a teen parent education program. So the section on line 3 there, the way that the net cost per pupil is calculated under state law is it allows for a proration if the student's not a full-time student. So this language on lines 5 through 10 would allow the teen parent education program to not count any absences of a teen parent that are due to giving or recovering from birth towards that they're not in school full-time, so we're going to prorate you. So those they would be considered full-time if their absences were for giving birth or recovering from birth.
They're full-time students. They're just not there necessarily for the full year. They may come in at some point after the school year is initiated, not stay for the full class.
Yes, I would really encourage you to hear testimony from these programs. But yes, I think the students are coming and going from these programs at any time during a school year. And then current law on page 2, line 14, also allows if a student is in a tuitioning district, I'm talking about the language that's struck here on lines 14 through 21. The student is in a tuitioning district, ascending district, and they go to a teen parent education program. Current law allows for the student's home district, sending district, to pay 17% of that prior year's statewide average net cost per pupil to the school that they're tuitioning the student to when the student is not in the teen parent education program for costs related to coordination of services for the student. So up above, remember the home district, if it's not a tuitioning district, is only paying 83%. So, I think there's the presumption there that they're keeping that 17% for themselves to provide for the coordination of services. But if the tuitioning, if the student's district of residence does not maintain a brick and mortar and actually tuitions the student to another school, that other school is doing the coordination. When is the student coming to our school? When is the student going to the teen parent program? And so that 17% would go to the private school or other public school. And so this bill proposes to remove that 17%. And that's consistent with the amendment on lines 1 through 2, which is keeping the teen parent education program's net cost per pupil at 100%. This is not super straightforward or easy to understand. Further complicated by the fact that this doesn't live anywhere in the green books. You can't see it kind of in context with everything else. But it's essentially what this bill proposes to do is if a student is in a teen parent education program, that teen parent education program gets 100% of the average net cost per pupil, full stop.
For as long as they're
For as long as they're there, and remember there's that proration
Yeah.
allowed, but this bill would also say if you're on maternity leave,
Yeah.
if you're recovering from or
Having your baby.
giving birth, you're
Yeah.
having your baby,
Yeah.
we're not going to count those absences against you.
Right. you.
And I did check, you are getting, the Senate is getting a miscellaneous tax bill from the House.
Thank you.
S-120, an act relating to post-secondary schools and sexual misconduct protections. We've already almost had a complete walkthrough of this bill. Your two previous witnesses did a great job. You have me for another 5 minutes or so. Do you want me to try and quickly walk through it, or did you have specific questions about language?
Is there anything that you heard from the witnesses or didn't hear from the witnesses that you think it's important for us to? I agree, they did a good job of.
And I'm not trying,
providing an overview.
I'm not trying to abdicate my responsibility here, just
I
on a
understand.
time basis here. One of the things this bill proposes to do, the Intercollegiate Sexual Harm Prevention Council, I don't know that I heard this specifically, is there's a sunset date in current law. Did you all go over that?
Yes,
Oh, okay,
you did go over that, I believe. You did cover that, yeah.
okay. So, this bill proposes,
2025, yeah.
yes, so this
yeah.
bill proposes to repeal that sunset date and make
Yeah.
it in perpetuity until your future legislatures make any changes. So I would just point that out if that's something that you're interested in, a small piece, an amendment to make. And then, depending on if you take this up or which portions you take up, I may have kind of comments on some of the language. And what it's trying to do. I will also say, the way I drafted this, currently the Intercollegiate Sexual Harm Prevention Council lives in the Vermont State Colleges chapter in Title 16. But it is an intercollegiate, right? It's all post-secondary schools. So one of the things that I've proposed as I drafted this is moving all of the Intercollegiate Sexual Harm Prevention Council and then all of the new requirements created in this bill into a different chapter where all the post-secondary school requirements are.
How does this intersect with Title IX?
So Title IX is it protects people in education programs that receive federal funding from sex-based discrimination. And you'll see Title IX referenced throughout here. So it doesn't really impact Title, it doesn't change the Title IX process at all. It creates different support systems, I would say, for folks who may be involved in the Title IX process, but the Title IX process is very specific. It has a very specific definition of when it kicks in. And so not all of the conduct that I think is contemplated as potentially in this bill would fit under a Title IX process. And Title IX investigations have a whole host of federal requirements that you cannot trump. So I don't see anything in here that would conflict with Title IX. When we have more time, whether it's myself or someone else who is far more familiar with Title IX could certainly come in and give you a Title IX investigation 101. But it's federal law, so you can't trump it. You can be more protective, but you can't be less protective. But I don't see anything in here that would conflict with it.
Yeah, and I think we need to hear from the Association of Independent Colleges, UVM, and state colleges, and get their impressions and see if we can start to pull some of this apart and we'll look into it this year. Okay. Committee, any questions for Ms. St. James? Ms. Barquist, anything else from you? Thank you.
Great.
Jay Nichols We'll give them just a minute, maybe take a couple minutes. Why don't we just take 2 minutes and come back at 5 after, and we'll finish with Jay. I know people have meetings starting at 4. Jay, do you mind if